Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and it's my privilege to serve as director of the library here in Ann Arbor and also the museum in Grand Rapids. I'm so glad you're here tonight and showing excellent judgment in coming to us first before you go home and watch the final game of the World Series. And just credit our fine arrangements with the national media that we arranged the timing of their game to follow this program. So we're very glad you're here. Tonight's program is brought to you with the support of all of us who are part of the National Archives and Records Administration, our parent organization, with essential support from the Ford Presidential Foundation. They make possible, and your support for the Ford Foundation makes possible all of our public programs and exhibits. Tonight, the big event is Ken Walsh, who is an accomplished journalist and author discussing his recently released book, Ultimate Insiders, White House Photographers and How They Shape History. When I say newly released, it really is, because it just hit the bookshelves at bookstores a couple of weeks ago. This is a repeat visit for Ken. We've counted up in all of my introductions, and it's his 5th time speaking here at the library and museum. I think that's a world record in itself, Ken. He started in 2009 when he spoke about President Obama's first year in office, so he's a part of our family now. That first visit was with Ken as a winner of the Ford Journalism Award for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency, and he has won that award 2 additional times, so he's a pro and very knowledgeable about this matter. As you know, for his day job, Ken is the chief White House correspondent for U.S. News, and he is one of the longest-serving White House correspondents in history. He has covered the presidency, presidential campaigns, and national politics since 1986, spanning the presidencies from Ronald Reagan through Barack Obama and now President Trump, and has traveled to more than 60 countries while doing all of this. As a part of his day job, he writes a daily blog, Ken Walsh's Washington, and also a weekly column on the presidency. And we were just talking about the changes from print media to electronic media, and perhaps we'll talk about that a little bit as well. Ken is the author of 8 books, including tonight's. Other ones he has talked about here at the library and museum include one on Air Force One, which is fascinating. Prisoners of the White House, you might recall, The Isolation of America's Presidents and the Crisis of Leadership. Celebrity in Chief, A History of the Presidents and the Culture of Stardom, to just name a few. Tonight he's talking about this brand new book regarding the unique and frankly intimate perspective and relationship that White House photographers have with their respective president. In the words of Time magazine, Ken Walsh tells the story of one of the most exclusive clubs in photojournalism, the personal photographers to the President of the United States. Behind-the-scenes stories and intimate portraits of brilliant men and women are in this club. Ken's book is an affecting portrait of this work and the special people who have practiced it. Ken spoke at the museum last week to a full audience and received rave reviews, and I'm sure tonight we'll have an equally good time. So please welcome Ken Walsh back to the Ford Library.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you all for coming. I'll be watching the series last game tonight after we're done too, so we'll all be in the same position. I always love to come to the Ford Library and Museum. I'm a big fan of the presidential libraries in general. I've done many hours, days of research at the libraries, and this is one of my favorites. I also wanted to just mention, I've covered the White House for 31 years now. I'm one of the longest serving, as Elaine said, White House correspondents. And when you're a White House correspondent, you're always looking for different ways to tell people what the presidency is like, what the presidents are like. And in this case, I've known these chief photographers at the White House my whole career covering the White House. They're fascinating people. Many times, as I've discovered doing this book, they're sort of everyday people who end up in this fascinating position with this amazing perch to look at presidents of the United States, the most powerful people in the world. And what I tried to do in the book is to show the presidency through the eyes and the lenses and the observations of these ultimate insiders, because the photographers get amazing access to the presidents. And one thing that they all tell you, and I've interviewed all the chief photographers except one who is still alive, they tell you that you need two things to be a very good White House photographer. You need to be a good photographer, but just as important, if not more important, you need to have trust, the trust of the president and the first lady. If you don't have that, you can't really do very much in the White House. And David Kennerly, who was Gerald Ford's photographer, had that trust. Other photographers have had it, others have not had it, and we're going to talk a little bit about that now. But what I'm trying to give you is a sense of what the photographers were like, but also mostly what the presidents were like, as seen by the photographers from this very impressive inside perch that they had. Anyway, this is the cover of the book. But I wanted to start off going back to Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, of course, was elected in 1860. And he's the first president who understood the power and importance of photography in politics and in government. He ran as what people thought of as a frontiersman. People thought he was sort of a country bumpkin coming from the then wilds of Illinois. So he thought he had to show the country more of a sense of stature and gravitas. He gave a speech in New York at a place called Cooper Union to the intelligentsia of New York. He realized it would be a very important speech in his campaign, and he had a picture taken to distribute around the country as part of his campaign, the first time this was done. And this is the picture that was taken. He, of course, looks far from the rail splitter, which is the image he had at the time, the sort of the country frontiersman. He went to the studio in New York of a photographer named Mathew Brady, who later became famous as a Civil War photographer. And Mathew Brady saw Lincoln. He hadn't known Lincoln before. He knew he was running for president. He thought, this is going to be a real challenge. This was not a good-looking man, first of all, and he came in with rumpled clothes, dusty, and so on. And so Brady decided he's not going to just show a headshot, which is what they did at the time. And they were having these little postcard-sized photographs that were distributed around the country of famous people. So photography was coming into vogue, and Lincoln knew he could capitalize on this. So he had the picture taken, and see what Brady has done. He's pulled the camera back so you can see literally the stature of Abraham Lincoln, very tall for that age. You can't really see the creases and blemishes on his face. And he put his hand on a little pile of books to show every edition. And this worked. This picture was distributed all around the country, and people thought that this guy looks like a guy who could be president. And this was very important in that campaign. Lincoln later said that if it was not for this picture, he didn't think he would be elected, because it bonded people around the country to this image of Lincoln that he wanted to convey as a guy who was sort of capable of being president and had the strength and seriousness to do it. When he became president, he also used photography. This is a famous picture that he distributed around the country, the resolute, strong Lincoln. Of course, the beard has appeared. This was another thing he did. He had some 4 dozen pictures taken of himself while he was president. It was unheard of at the time, but he knew photography was important in creating an image which presidents have kept as a guiding principle ever since. I'm not going to talk about all the presidents tonight, but we'll fast forward to the ones that I think you might be most interested in. Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt understood photography very, very well. He understood publicity and public relations. Theodore Roosevelt adopted a philosophy of life which he called the strenuous life, which he meant, by that he meant you would excel in everything you did privately and publicly. So he was a horseman, he was a boxer, he was a canoe, he ran, he hiked, did all kinds of things. And he liked pictures taken of that and distributed to the country by news photographers, not staff photographers at the White House. That didn't come till later. But he had a very good relationship with news photographers, photojournalists. He would have the photographers go with him when he'd ride. He'd do the shot over and over again because sometimes he would fall off the horse. And he'd come back to the White House and his wife would say, he's all scratched up and bleeding. He said, well, it didn't go too well today, but they did get a number of shots of him jumping his horse, which he thought made him look like the vigorous leader of the strenuous life. He was also the first president to travel around outside the country. He visited the Panama Canal, which is one of his great achievements as president, and he had pictures distributed of that visit. A real path breaker. This is him in a giant steam shovel. And this again showed this guy who was doing things that others hadn't done, the guy pushing the border of the activist president. And he also went to convey his personal popularity to his agenda through photography. Here he visits Yosemite, which he was creating national parks, or what became the national parks, preserving federal land. He's here with John Muir, the famous naturalist. And so you see what he's doing is he's using photography to create an image of not only himself, but of his agenda, so it will stay in people's minds. I always get a kick out of the comment of his daughter, who said her father, and she said this as a serious comment, she said her father always wanted to be the center of attention. He wanted to be the baby at every christening, the bride at every wedding, and the corpse at every funeral, she said. So, and he succeeded in dominating whatever he did very effectively. Now we fast forward again a little bit, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, a distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt. He really dominated the main medium of his time, which is radio and also newspapers, but he understood the importance of photography too. It's interesting because as I've talked about this book to different people, White House press secretaries and various others, and I just was talking about this to Mike McCurry, who was Bill Clinton's press secretary for a while, and he said, so many of the images we have of the presidents are still photographs, still. They stay in our minds. Of course, there's video, motion pictures, and so on, but the still photography still has a certain power. And the best presidents understand that. And Franklin Roosevelt did understand it. This is the jaunty, optimistic Franklin Roosevelt, which is the image he liked to convey. There were many, many pictures like this conveyed of Roosevelt with the news photographers. Early in his administration, his press secretary met with the photographers, the news photographers at the White House, and said, I have a bargain for you. You'll have the most access that any photographers had ever had to a president if you do one thing. Don't show that President Roosevelt is disabled from polio. And he was. He had polio, his legs were paralyzed. When you see pictures of him walking, that was basically a made-up moment, because he always would have one of his sons or a Secret Service agent holding his elbows, and he'd lock his arms into place. And they were literally dragging him across the floor, making it look like he was walking. He really wasn't. But the photographers didn't show this. There was a case where he would be lifted, in many cases, where he'd be lifted in and out of his vehicles. He'd be carried from one place to another. You never saw pictures of that at the time. If you saw them, they were taken by a bystander, not a news photographer, because the news photographers agreed to this, what later they had some regret about, because they felt it was sort of a conspiracy of silence to protect Franklin Roosevelt, so people wouldn't know the extent of his disability. New photographers would show up at the White House, and the veterans, when they saw the new photographer taking a picture of his braces on his legs or his crutches, they'd slap the camera down, say, we don't do this. We don't take pictures of that of President Roosevelt. And it's rare to see pictures like this, but this is one that one of his family took at Hyde Park, New York, where I'll be speaking on the book in a couple of weeks. And this is a family took a picture of Roosevelt in his wheelchair. Very rare picture. You don't see many of these photographs. This was the private Roosevelt that the country didn't get to see. But it's in the visual history at his presidential library, and I have pictures like this in my book. So it is part of the historical record, but it has to be found. And this is what his private life was like in his wheelchair. Now, I'm going to fast forward again a little bit. I'm going to spend a little bit of time now on President Kennedy, because President Kennedy was the first president who hired a staff photographer, a chief photographer who was on the White House payroll. He was an Army captain named Cecil Stoughton, who had been a photographer in the military, and Kennedy brought him in on the advice of a general who was his military aide, because the general said, you're going to want pictures of yourself. You're going to want this historic administration documented, so why don't you bring in a special photographer to do that? Kennedy did that, and every president since has done that, except for Jimmy Carter, by the way, and I'll come back to him in a moment. But the reason I show this is a picture of John F. Kennedy as the commander of PT-109, his PT boat in the Pacific. Remember what happened? A Japanese vessel hit the PT boat, sank it, and he rescued some of his crew. He was actually a genuine hero. His father, who was grooming his sons to be leaders of the country, he was grooming his first son, Joe Jr., but Joe Jr. was killed in World War II. So he groomed his next son, Jack. He found this picture and he distributed this. He was a fabulously wealthy man, so he was creating an image of his son as part of a future presidential campaign. And they used this during the campaign, and remember there was a movie made about it, PT 109, starring Cliff Robertson. But basically, this is the start of sort of political public relations using photography very early in a person's political life, where they're using Kennedy's status in World War II as a hero. The father also used still photography to create this image of this charismatic young man and his wife. This is their wedding, which was in Newport, Rhode Island, and in the early 50s, and it was the hit of the social season, not only in the Northeast, but around the country. People just wanted to know more about this beautiful couple. This is after they were wed. They're sitting at their luncheon before the people fill the table, but this is obviously very young Jack and Jacqueline Kennedy, and this is the kind of picture that was spread around the country by Joe Kennedy, and it was used in Life magazine and Look magazine, and the picture magazines at the time. It was a very effective technique. So Joe Kennedy now is using photography to help his son, and it works. In addition to other things, this is a wonderful picture of the family after it became clear that Kennedy had won the election in 1960. They're stated high on support. This is actually, I think, a more interesting picture than the formal portraits of the family, because you can get a sense of the joy and the buoyancy of the family, how much President Kennedy, newly elected president, is the center of everybody's attention. Everybody's looking. The father, you can see, is looking at his son. Everybody looks like they're having a wonderful time. You see Teddy there, Bobby. Jackie is looking up, sitting on the red dress next to a Rose. So anyway, it's a wonderful picture. It gives you the sense of that big family that everybody came to identify that with. Many people did. The Kennedy clan, as they called it. It continued, the use of photography in his presidency. This was supposed to be a portrait of President Kennedy and his wife Jacqueline and their daughter Caroline. And of course, Caroline had to nibble on the pearls. And it became a wonderful, endearing picture that many people still remember. This was widely distributed. Kennedy, the family man, this wonderful family that he had, that he was capitalizing on, and he was capitalizing on. He was using it for political purposes, for public relations, and it was working for him. He had, as I mentioned, Cecil Stoughton as his chief photographer. He also brought in photojournalists that he trusted, and he brought them in to give him special access, unheard of access for any president, and rare since then, that Kennedy gave the access to. There was one case where a photographer named Stanley Tredick, who actually I knew Stanley Tredick, he's passed away now, and he was very popular with the Kennedys because he got wonderful pictures, and he was a big fan of the Kennedys. He lost his objectivity really completely. He wanted to get do a photo spread of president and son, father and son, President Kennedy and John Jr. Jackie at this point thought the kids were getting too much in the news and in photography, so she said, no, I don't want the kids to have their picture taken anymore for a while. So Jackie goes off to vacation in Greece. President Kennedy calls Stanley Tredick and said, the coast is clear, come on over. And this is the picture they came up with. This is one of the most famous presidential pictures ever. John Jr. would come into his dad's desk, to his desk in the Oval Office, and there was a little trap door there that he called his little house. So he went into the little house, and he would like to open the door and surprise people who were in the room. And President Kennedy is pretending to be at work here, but obviously he could barely keep a straight face. And they got a wonderful picture. Stanley, this is one of his most famous pictures. After Kennedy saw this picture, he said, he saw it in proofs before they were published. And he said, Stan, you can't miss with any of these pictures, can you? And Stan said, no. And Kennedy said, I don't think anybody can miss with pictures of me and the kids. And they were right. So he understood that very, very thoroughly. There's other moments that were captured. His press conferences, carried on television, but also the TV images were just very vivid, but so were the still photographs. You got a sense here of the wit and the ease in which Kennedy held news conferences. We wish we had more of that today in the White House, I must say. We rarely have press conferences anymore. But anyway, you could get a sense of how deft Kennedy was at this. There was another case, and I mentioned how news photographers were a big part of the Kennedy publicity machine. When he trusted a news photographer, he gave him incredible access. There was a New York Times photographer named George Thames. You might have heard of George. George got amazing access to Kennedy because Kennedy trusted George. He was able, during a day in the life of the Presidency Project, to go in and out of the Oval Office all day with the door open, no matter what Kennedy was doing. If there was some secret discussion about military or whatever, they would ask George to leave. But he was basically in there, in and out all day. At one point, he noticed Kennedy got up from his desk and went to the windows. And this is the picture he got. Became known as the loneliest job, is what George entitled this picture. Kennedy looks like he has the weight of the world on his shoulders, he's sort of looking down and all. That's not at all what this picture is. All it is Kennedy's reading the newspaper, standing up. That's all it is. But it had this larger meaning. When people see this picture, they think it's some dramatic insight into the burdens of the presidency. It's not that at all. But it was captured that way, and so they sort of lucked out in that moment. And then, of course, sort of on a sad note, another picture we all remember when Kennedy was killed. The funeral, the family was here. There were only 2 photographers of hundreds of photographers at this funeral who got this picture, because most of them were training their cameras on the widow, on Jackie Kennedy, on Bobby, on Teddy. And what happened was Mrs. Kennedy leaned down and whispered in John Jr.'s ear, "Why don't you step forward and give your dad a salute of goodbye?" So she actually encouraged him to do this, and he did. He's trying to salute his dad. Didn't quite really understand what was happening, but it's a picture that those of us of a certain age all remember of that terrible experience for the country when the president was killed. But anyway, another case where still photography is a very memorable moment in our presidential history. Now this is another probably the single most memorable picture ever taken of a president, and that's Lyndon Johnson being sworn in on the day Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in 1963. He's on Air Force One. He decides that he wants this picture taken on Air Force One, and he wants it sent around the world. He wanted the country to know and the world to know that the Constitution endured and that he was going to continue the Kennedy legacy. So he wants Jackie Kennedy in the picture with him. She's wearing the same outfit she wore that morning when her husband was killed, the blood-stained pink suit. And this was very vivid to all of us who were sort of conscious at that point in the history of our country, but it caused a lot of hard feelings among the Kennedy entourage, because a lot of the Kennedy staffers felt that Johnson should not have put Jackie Kennedy through this. But she understood. She never held it against Lyndon Johnson. She understood he was trying to make a larger point about the enduring nature of the presidency, and so she was fully willing to go along with this. One other quick story about this. Sometimes things don't work as well as they should in any White House. Johnson wanted Cecil Stoughton, who I mentioned was Kennedy's chief photographer, to take the picture. So Cecil rushes from the hospital, gets on the plane, the last minute, he gets on a couch and stands up and starts to snap pictures just as the swearing in is happening, and the camera doesn't work. Fortunately, he had another camera with him, but he jiggled a couple of wires that were loose, and then he missed 2 frames, but he got 5 frames. And so he did get the picture, but it almost didn't happen. Sort of a backstory of Cecil Stoughton. Now Johnson, the pictures of Johnson, it's interesting because he didn't keep Cecil Stoughton as his chief photographer. He felt he would get Cecil's pictures every day. Now today there are millions, literally millions of pictures taken of a president. In those days, before digital photography, it was much more limited in the pictures. So Johnson would look at the pictures, the prints, contact sheets every day, and he'd sit at his desk and he'd throw them on the floor if he didn't like them. There was several cases where he didn't like any of them, and he said to Cecil, "Why don't you make me look as good as you made Jack Kennedy look?" Well, that was never going to happen. And so Johnson insisted on having pictures taken, letting the news photographers take his picture in settings that appalled his staff. He was trying to show his own sort of populist approach, But a lot of people were shocked by it because it didn't transfer to the modern age too well. This is a famous thing he would do with his beagles. He'd lift them up by their ears. And whenever he did this, he thought this was great, and he'd say, I always get letters from people saying I'm abusing my dogs. Well, they like it, he'd say. I don't know if they like it so much, but basically he kept doing it, and this is the kind of thing he was known for. He was this larger-than-life, rough-hewn guy, and he thought the country would respond to it, but he never really did get that popularity that he wanted. Another famous case where there were rumors spreading that he had cancer. He didn't have cancer, he had a problem with his gallbladder, and he had surgery. So he said, I'm going to have the photographers in, and I'm going to prove that I don't have cancer by showing his gallbladder scar. You can't imagine a president doing anything like this today. But this was what Johnson did. And it actually worked, though, because after this, people felt, well, I guess he doesn't have cancer. He really does have a gallbladder they had to remove. So this was another moment, a classic Lyndon Johnson moment. This is another moment that you might have seen this picture. During the Vietnam War, Johnson never wanted to convey how badly the war was going. He wanted to always be more optimistic and positive. His son-in-law, Chuck Robb, who later became governor of Virginia and senator from Virginia, was a Marine infantry captain at the time, and he sent Johnson a reel-to-reel tape recording, which you can see at the bottom right of this picture, describing what conditions were really like in Vietnam, and you can see Johnson's reaction. He's just anguished by it. He didn't feel he could show this in public, but he let the White House photographer capture this image of him in anguish. And by the way, his White House photographer, he did fire Cecil Stoughton, and he brought in a Japanese-American photographer named Ichi Okamoto, and I'll show you pictures of him in a little bit. But he was actually one of the best White House photographers ever. He brought in the whole pattern of storytelling, of White House photographers telling stories, not just snapping isolated moments, using pictures to tell stories. And he certainly did that with Lyndon Johnson. Now Nixon comes into office. Nixon did not like photographers, did not like photography. He felt he just wanted to be a man of ideas and action, and he thought that his own photographer, a guy named Ollie Atkins, giving him too much access was just a waste of his time. I think this was a big mistake, but this is the way Nixon felt. This is the kind of image he wanted to convey, the strong, decisive leader. He would let Ollie Atkins, now you imagine Kennedy, you can't imagine Kennedy doing something like this, but he would have Ollie Atkins come in and take a picture or take some shots, and he'd have what he called 6 and out, which means he would listen for the shutter to click 6 times, and then he'd say, Ollie, you're out of here. So he couldn't ever get that many pictures. He did try to use photographer outreach sometimes. The White House got a call one afternoon. Somebody said he was Elvis Presley. Said, I'm Elvis Presley. I would like to meet the president. I am a fan of law enforcement. I would like to get a law enforcement badge so I can help catch drug dealers. They said, sure. Well, it turned out it was Elvis Presley, and he did arrange a meeting with the president, and this is the single most requested photograph of the Nixon presidency, Nixon and Elvis. What happened was Elvis got in, and Nixon didn't really know what to say to Elvis. He didn't know much about him or anything. So the best he could come up with in chit-chat was, that's quite an outfit you have on there, Mr. Presley. And Elvis says, you have your audience and I have mine. Pretty good answer. And, but Elvis got his badge, by the way, and Nixon got his photograph. Didn't make much difference in the long range of things in outreach, but it did happen. And another irony is that Elvis was abusing prescription drugs himself at this time, and he wanted to catch the bad drug guy. So anyway, but this was another interesting Nixon moment with photography. Nixon, as I said, did not let his chief photographer take a lot of candid private pictures of him. But on the night before he left office, he announced he was resigning the next day. He invited Ollie Atkins, his photographer, over to get some pictures of the family in the residence, and he's let his guard down. This is a very rare picture of Nixon showing some private emotion in a moment of his ultimate setback when he's leaving office. Tricia, one of his daughters, is on the left there, looking like she's ready to burst into tears. There's her husband there, and Nixon is hugging his daughter, Julie. A very, very emotional moment. The photographer recounted this and said he didn't know really what to say or how to behave. He wanted to get out of there because it was such a heavy, sad atmosphere, and he didn't really know how to deal with it because it was so unlike Nixon to let people see this sort of thing. The next day, before Nixon left office, Ollie got this picture, excuse me, of his final meal. Let me have a sip of water. It strikes me as very poignant because here's a man who had been at the height of power, and yet he resorts to this sort of Spartan final moment, which I think Ollie captured in an interesting way. And we come to Gerald Ford. David Kennerly, his chief photographer, did have amazing access to Jerry Ford. He's showing him as the ruminative, deliberative president here. He never got credit for this, but he really was that way. This is a picture of Ford and Kennerly. You can see their positive relationship here. He had pictures taken of excuse me, other leaders like Leonid Brezhnev. I'm not quite sure why Brezhnev is wearing that big coat, but he sort of looks bizarre, to say the least. Here's Ford in his pajamas, having a meeting with his senior staff. He did this. He let the photographers see this kind of moment, and we don't see this kind of thing hardly ever anymore. A president, excuse me, giving this kind of access to a photographer, but it did humanize Jerry Ford. Also, he found out, the photographers realized he was taking a swim every day. So instead of just giving access to one photographer, he let them all in. And they got pictures of Jerry Ford doing laps in the White House pool. George Thames, the photographer who took that picture of the loneliest job, he's the guy on his elbows, the second from the left. That's George Thames. Gerald Ford also had some moments of embarrassment. This is him skiing in Vail. At that time, I was working for the Denver Post. And so I covered some of this before I got to Washington. And later on, when I won his award, as Elaine mentioned, I won President Ford's award a number of times. He said, "So you're the guy who used to cover me when I went skiing in Denver?" And I said, "Yeah, I wasn't the photographer, but I did cover it." And he said, "Well, it was all my fault. I'm the one who took the spills. I'm the one who fell. So I'm not blaming anybody else." So he was incredibly magnanimous. And those people who knew Jerry Ford always really admired this about him, that he was very much an everyman and was not into blame or pointing fingers. And then this is another interesting picture I thought you'd like to see. Betty Ford, as the Ford presidency was winding down, she told David Kennerly, the photographer, you know, she used to be a dancer. I always wanted to dance on the cabinet table in the cabinet room. So she did, and he got the picture of it. And you can't picture first ladies doing things like this anymore, but Betty was a real free spirit. And then this is another interesting picture, just to show the private access that Kennerly got. After Betty's surgery, she's got a sort of a get well card, and President Ford is in there. He was very emotional, of course. He felt, his wife was had a lethal disease, but he let Kennerly get the picture. He wanted to have this documented for history, and he did when he visited her after her surgery. And this is Kennerly and Ford in the Oval Office, again, to show the access that Ford gave his photographer, which I think held him in good stead. And presidents really could take a lesson from this, trying to show the visual history of a presidency, and giving the photographer access, I think, is basically a good idea for presidents. And Jerry Ford understood this. Now, of course, when I have talked about this before, people have asked in the audience, well, why don't you include Jimmy Carter, who defeated Jerry Ford? Jimmy Carter did not hire a chief photographer, and his staff thought it was a big mistake. he kept some of the staff photographers. We never hired a chief photographer, didn't give a lot of access to the photographers. What pictures do you remember of Jimmy Carter privately? Almost none, because he didn't think it was worth his while, like Nixon in some ways. He just felt, it's not worth my time to give the access. We'll just go for the public pictures. And so I think he missed a lot of opportunities there to humanize himself and to dramatize himself, which he didn't do. And that's why there's very few pictures of Jimmy Carter that have stood the test of time. Very rare. But now another president who understood this was Ronald Reagan. This is one of his most favorite photographs of himself, taken by his photographer Michael Evans. It was at his ranch in California. Reagan always thought this showed him as the genial Westerner, the guy who was not a Washington insider, who was a man of almost a Western landman from the last century. He loved this picture, and he understood the importance of photography. So there are a lot of wonderful pictures of Reagan in still photography, in addition to television, of course. Now, this is one of the most famous pictures of Reagan. This is when he was shot in March of 1981. He'd only been in president for several weeks, and he left a speech in the Washington Hilton, and a young fellow named John Hinckley Jr. shot him, shot his press secretary, a couple of law enforcement officers. This is the moment when Reagan is hit. This picture won a Pulitzer Prize. His chief photographer, Mike Evans, was not in position to get this picture. So the news photographer, Ron Edmonds from the AP, got the picture. He won a Pulitzer for this. This is what happened was, you can see the two Secret Service agents on the left are now looking over at the shooter instantaneously. The shots are rung out. One of the bullets has bounced off the armor-plated limousine and has penetrated Reagan's ribs, coming at rest near his heart. So they push him into the car. They decide not to go to the White House. The Secret Service takes him to local hospital emergency room, which saved his life, because he would have almost certainly died if he had not gone to the hospital immediately. He was very conscious of image and always acting the part of the presidency. I'm not saying that critically. So when he stopped at the front of the emergency room, they opened the door for him. He got out of the car, the limo, hitched up his trousers, buttoned his jacket, walked on his own steam into the lobby, and then he collapsed, and he almost died. It's an interesting insight into the president's relationships with the photographers and all they see. Michael Evans, his chief photographer, was so shocked seeing Reagan in the condition he was in, pale, looking like he was at death's door, being put on a gurney and wheeled into surgery. He didn't take any pictures of it because he was so emotionally overwrought. That completely violates any news judgment of a photographer, that you don't take the most dramatic picture because you're emotionally involved with it. But he later admitted that he couldn't bring himself to do it because he felt it was too private a moment, and his hero, the president, had almost been killed. But now, over time, Reagan did understand that there were other things he could use photography to sort of leaven his image, to soften his image, and so you got stuff like this, where he would just sort of almost make fun of himself, letting the news photographers take pictures of him. So he did understand the importance of still photography. Now, this is a famous picture of George Bush, who was Reagan's vice president. George Bush was not camera savvy, but he understood the importance of photography. And this was a picture when he was still vice president, but Dave Valdez, who was his chief photographer, both his vice presidency and presidency, he acknowledges this is his most famous picture. Bush was at his home in Kennebunkport, Maine, and he wanted to acknowledge that one of the magazines wanted to do a spread on him. He didn't want them to intrude on the privacy of the family, so he let his photographer Valdez take the pictures, which the magazine used, including when the grandchildren burst into his bedroom, which is what this is, and went to play with Grandpa and Grandma, and that's Doro, his daughter, there. He doesn't look like he's ready for the cameras, does he? But this is what he did during his presidency, too. There were cases where he was always looking disheveled. He wouldn't brush his hair. He would not let the photographers take him from the angles that they wanted to take him. He didn't like what he called stagecraft. And this is an example of it. Sometimes Barbara would say, George, at least brush your hair before you let the photographers in. But he wouldn't do it. And this was an interesting moment. This reflects in this picture. Of course, he loses to Bill Clinton. A lot of private photography of Bill Clinton with his chief photographer, Bob McNeely. Clinton did understand the importance of photography, but McNeely ended up getting more than he bargained for sometimes, because Clinton did let him take a lot of pictures that didn't show him the most flattering way. He had a flash and fade temper, and this is a case of that. This is the back of George Stephanopoulos, who was his communications director. Now, of course, is an ABC host of a morning show, and he's berating George. Why are you letting those reporters ask those terrible questions about me? Why aren't you controlling my image better? And George says, well, there's nothing I can do about it. And so then Clinton cusses and fusses, and then he moves on. It was a flash and fade temper, but McNeely did get to capture this, and you can see this in the visual archive at the Clinton Library. This is the famous picture of Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. This is another interesting little story I'll tell you. Of course, Clinton was under investigation for a number of things, and the special counsel, Kenneth Starr, found that Clinton had misrepresented what he had done with women, and he had lied about a affair he had with Monica Lewinsky, who was a former White House intern. And this is what got him impeached, by the way. Time Magazine's Dirk Halstead, who I talked to and who's in the book and recounts the story, he said, you know, I think I've seen her somewhere. But at this point, no pictures had emerged of Monica Lewinsky. So he hired a researcher, and he and the researcher spent many hours looking through his endless files, and they found the picture of her. You see, just because he barely remembered this. Clinton had gone to a fundraiser, and she was always trying to get his attention. And she'd wear these berets, and she'd show up in the front of the rope lines when he's shaking hands. And boy, did she ever get his attention. So, but anyway, that's sort of a little side story that sometimes the news photographers do manage to get the shot that the staff photographers don't get or aren't allowed to get. Another iconic picture, now George W. Bush. This was the 9/11, 3 days after 9/11, when the World Trade Towers went down. George Bush was not too steady in first at handling this, but then he righted himself. He went to ground zero, still smoldering from the 2 trade towers going down with the planes having hit them. He jumps up on the rubble of a burned out fire truck. He pulls this fellow up out of the crowd, turned out to be a volunteer firefighter who had retired and was there just to help out. He starts to address the firefighters and first responders, and they say, we can't hear you, we can't hear you. So he grabs a bullhorn and he says, I can hear you, and the people who knock these buildings down will hear from all of us very soon. The perfect thing the country wanted to hear from their president at that moment. And so a lot of people remember this. I happen to have been in the pool of reporters that was just at the base of this. I was just off camera, but I saw this for myself, and of course if you were there, you knew immediately this was going to be a very memorable moment in the history of the Bush presidency. Now we're up to President Obama, celebrity president from day one. He, of course, was the first African-American president, and he sort of made history from the beginning. And so he was a celebrity, and this is pictures, people taking his picture with the new technology, with the smartphones and so on. He gave his photographer, Pete Souza, tremendous access. Souza, by the way, had been a junior photographer of Reagan. A completely different party, a completely different person, a personality, and now he comes back with Obama as Obama's chief photographer. And this is another really famous picture. This is the raid that Obama ordered, a very dangerous mission to kill bin Laden, the terrorist responsible for masterminding the 9/11 attacks. And you can see what they're doing is they're watching the raid in real time on a screen. You see the military officers controlling the images that they're watching. This President Obama, they're all looking very serious. Hillary Clinton, who's Secretary of State at the time, looks like she's troubled by something she's seeing, but they're all crowded in here and they're actually watching this very historic moment. But Obama let his photographer do this to record the picture for history. It's become one of the most famous pictures of any presidency. And of course, I'm sure one of the reasons they let it be published widely is that the parade was a success. The photographers also get to see moments that illustrate the private parts of the presidency that people don't get to see, including the lack of privacy that the presidents have, and this really bothers them. This is a wonderful picture of the Obamas in a freight elevator. Lots of times presidents travel in freight elevators because they're more secure. They can get around without people knowing where they are. This looks like there's sort of a private, even an intimate moment going on here. President Obama has lent Michelle his jacket. But look at the Secret Service guys and the aides. They don't know where to look. They're looking at the floor, they're looking off to the side. One guy's looking at notes. One guy's just looking up into the future somewhere. But it just shows the difficulty presidents have of being private. And this is a case where Obama, it certainly bothered him, but he let this picture out. Another fabulous picture, I don't know if you remember this one. This shows what can happen when a president gives a photographer the access. And Sousa captured this brilliantly. Excuse me. It shows Obama took seriously this idea of being a role model, particularly for African-American young people. Excuse me. A staff member was retiring, leaving the White House, brought his family in, a young African-American family. The little boy looks at the president and says, "Your hair looks like mine. I wonder if it feels like mine." So President Obama says, "Why don't you see for yourself?" So he bends down, the little boy touches his hair, so Obama says, "What do you think?" And he murmurs something, so the father says, "Speak up, speak up." And he says, "Yeah, it feels just like mine." So it's that role model notion that, excuse me, Obama was very serious about, and you see that here. Now we're up to present time. President Trump. A lot of people ask me about this point I'm about to make. Why doesn't President Trump show some more kinder, gentler images of himself? Well, he doesn't. So when you see President Trump, it's that scowling, angry president that the image he wants to convey, particularly to his core supporters, the guy who's going to take Washington by the lapels and shake it and make it do what he wants. You rarely see those private moments that we saw with Obama, we saw with Kennedy, some other Reagan, because this is the kind of image he wants to convey. He's starting to do a little bit of that. You get pictures of him going across the South Lawn with his grandchildren, but basically, this is the Trump that he wants the country to see. This is him in an 18-wheeler, the tough guy, I'm going to make this thing happen by force of will, riding over my opponents, and this is all still in play, because I think that eventually he's going to realize that he has a lot to gain by having the private moments recorded. I mean, he does have grandchildren, he has children, and they apparently are devoted to him. There's got to be things that go on there that would make him look more accessible as a person, and he just doesn't let it be seen. And he doesn't trust his White House photographer, Sheila Craighead, to show this or release the picture, so we don't see that of him. And I think that's a mistake he's making, as Jimmy Carter made the mistake himself. And of course, he only lasted one term, but not a cause and effect, but it's part of the picture, literally. I'll wind up here, just show you some of the pictures of these chief photographers. This was Cecil Stoughton, Kennedy's chief photographer. He had some great techniques to get access, but largely by teaching the children how to use his cameras, which is what he's doing here. So they love Cecil. They called him Captain Stoughton because he was a captain in the Army. So he understood the access was important. This was Ichi Okamoto, Lyndon Johnson's photographer. This is a picture of him just to get a sense of, better look at him. Standing up to Lyndon Johnson was not easy under any circumstances, but particularly for Okamoto, who was much smaller than Johnson. So, but he was able to stand up to him and insist on getting pictures as a storyteller, as I mentioned before. And then, of course, there's Kennerly. Here's President Ford taking a picture of Kennerly, who's one of the finest White House photographers. This is Pete Sousa, who I mentioned before, Sheila Craighead, who's President Trump's chief photographer, the second woman to hold that job. And then I just always like to show the picture of the news photographers. While the staff photographer gets so many more private moments and special accesses, This is what the news photographers end up with. Just a mass scrum trying to get some little crumb of picture today out of President Trump. But this is the life that they lead, just trying to get something that is publishable. Just to wind up, as I say, what I'm trying to do here is to show the presidency through a different kind of lens, literally the lenses of the photographers, and through their eyes and their observations. And I think it's a unique way of looking at the presidency because these people have such access and get to know the president so well. And so that's what I was trying to do in the book, and I hope that you've enjoyed my talk, and I'm glad to take some questions from you now. Thank you very much. Yeah, we do have the microphones. I guess it's probably best if you use them so people can hear you and so we can get it on the taping.
You mentioned throughout the book efforts by White House staff and the president himself to determine which pictures are released and not.
Yes.
And so kind of a multi-part question here. Is there any congressional legislation regarding, well, first I should say, some pictures you said are in the National Archives, some are in the presidential libraries. Is there any legislation that controls this? Do presidential librarians have the ability to reject requests for photos? Were you denied in any way effort to get it? And finally, because your book is a commercial enterprise, did you have to pay for the pictures?
Right, well, okay, that's a number of points there, but they're all good ones. Once a president leaves office, all the pictures taken by the White House staff photographers are yours and mine. They're the taxpayers' pictures. So they owe you that. If you want that picture, you can get it, and it'll just reproduce it for you and send it. So as any publisher will tell you, try to use pictures of presidents. If you stick to the archives, to the presidential libraries, you're going to save a lot of money because there are pictures of the American people's pictures. So they don't charge you except for reproduction. It's very inexpensive, and it's a wonderful resource in writing a book or just for people who just are interested in the presidency. And I've looked through thousands and thousands of these photographs over the years. Now, how are they released? Some presidents, like Lyndon Johnson, wanted to approve them himself. Every one. Now, that's before the days of digital photography. Now, Pete Souza took 2 million pictures in 8 years. No president wants to look at 2 billion pictures, even of himself. So in that case, Obama let Souza decide. Most of the time what happens is a joint decision between the photographer, the staff photographers, not the journalistic photographers. That's a whole separate thing. They get what they get. It's not the White House's pictures. But so anyway, it's the joint decision of the staff photographer and the press office, the press secretary, the communications director. That's the way it mostly works. And today the press office is very careful about what pictures they get out about Trump. That's partly why you don't see these private pictures. I must say I'm doubtful that Sheila Craighead gets the pictures anyway. I don't think he likes to have her around. Maybe he will change his mind and will trust the photographer, but he hasn't done it yet. So anyway, that's part of the answer. If you try to get pictures from outside the government network, that's when you start to run into some real expense, because the estates of the photographers or the news organizations control those pictures, the news pictures, and they were taken basically at the permission of the White House, but they're not the White House's pictures. So that's a separate track if you want to get news pictures of presidents, and that tends to cost a lot of money because they charge you a lot for that.
So you're saying there is no power that a presidential librarian has, like, say, the Kennedy Library, the Johnson Library? Do they have any ability to restrict what?
There were a lot of complaints about the Kennedy Library in years past, because a lot of historians and researchers and photographers felt that they were being denied access solely because the Kennedys the family wanted to steer history into a positive direction of President Kennedy. I think a lot of that has gone away. They're a lot more accessible now. I mean, Elaine, I'm sure would know more about this than I would, but basically the Kennedy Library had a reputation for being very controlling for many years. Now, I think that's let up a little bit. Now, as far as Congress goes, it's a separation of powers thing. If it's a White House operation, it'd be very hard for Congress to justify getting into that and controlling it. It's really the executive branch. And Congress, I don't think, has shown any interest in doing this anyway. So anyway, there's multiple questions, but asked just as we do at the press conferences. So, thank you.
Hi, thank you. It seems that the photographer has really been able to capture the essence or personality of different presidents. If we take Kennedy, Reagan, Ford, Obama, there seems to be that relationship where there's permission to be free, and it also reflects on the personality of the president, whereas if you take Nixon, President Trump presently, it kind of gives a different picture just in terms of the relationship. I just want to make that point if you agree with that. And the questions I did have is, are you aware of any photos in the history there of the presidents that was rejected by the president, that somehow information came out about it that would have been a notable?
Yeah, well, I mean, during a presidency, a lot of the pictures are not released because sometimes the photographer doesn't release them. It feels that they're embarrassing, and this is sometimes the photographers get into sort of a propaganda operation to enhance the image of their president, and that actually happens a lot. But once they leave office, then everything is available, but you have to find it yourself. But the archivists are very helpful. They'll help you. So if that's one point. During the Kennedy presidency, there was a lot of desire well, first of all, Frank and Roosevelt, I mentioned, they didn't even let the pictures be taken of President Roosevelt's disability and his paralyzed legs. Kennedy, there's a case, those of us who've researched this sort of thing, he was rumored for a long time to be having an affair with Marilyn Monroe. And other women. But remember the famous case at Madison Square Garden? There was a birthday party for President Kennedy. There was news clips, you can find this on YouTube, where Peter Lawford, his brother-in-law, introduces Marilyn Monroe to sing Happy Birthday. She comes up onto the stage wearing a big coat, and she takes it off. She's wearing a skin-tight dress. She sings Happy Birthday, Mr. President, and it's a very provocative moment. And he gets up later to the podium and he says, my life is now complete. I've had Marilyn Monroe sing Happy Birthday to me in a sweet and innocent way. That's not at all what happened. At the reception after that birthday party at Madison Square Garden, Marilyn Monroe was there with President Kennedy wearing the same dress, and the Secret Service, at the request of the White House staff, confiscated the pictures because they didn't want the public to know. And this was Cecil Stoughton, the photographer's pictures. Kennedy didn't want the public to connect them too much. One of the pictures escaped confiscation. I don't know if you've seen this picture, but it's the picture of Marilyn Monroe in the dress. President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy are standing there talking to her. And it's not a good picture, but they're together. The reason it escaped scrutiny from the Secret Service is that in those days, you had pictures that you had to put in a chemical bath of the developer and the fixer, and then you took it out and you made the print. It was still in the chemicals, and the Secret Service didn't find it. And so we do have that picture. That's the only picture that I'm aware of President Kennedy with Marilyn Monroe. So.
Just one other quick question. This was not a picture, but I had read somewhere about a short film, that the Kennedy people made on Hyannis Port about a mock assassination.
Mock death. Well, that's in the book. That's in my book. What happened was one of the White House photographers, not Cecil Stoughton, but one of his assistants, tells the story, and this is again in the book. Kennedy, either he had a premonition or something, but he wanted a whole movie made. And so this staff photographer took the whole movie, and Kennedy had it all laid out. He got off the boat, he walked down the ramp, and then he falls down, and blood's coming from his mouth, fake blood. It's quite elaborately staged. Jackie steps over him. His old friend from World War II, Red Face, steps over him. And he had to shoot it a number of times because Kennedy didn't like some of the the way he photographed it. He videotaped it, well, whatever the technology was at the time. But we've never seen that. And he said, that's all I'll ever say about it because I feel it's private. But he did say that much. It's very macabre and it's very, very strange. But it apparently did happen. And people think it was a premonition he had. But that's all we know.
I have a question about the change in photography, especially with our current administration. You mentioned at the beginning that we don't really have press conferences as much anymore. And also the idea the media has changed in terms of how reliable it is. And I'm wondering if you're thinking that there's been a change in photography as well, and whether that photography is changing to influence people in a negative way. Last week, we had Hillary Clinton here and also Charles Blow, and they both seemed to talk about this, and I was wondering if you would comment on it as well. Thank you.
Well, yeah, photography has changed a great deal, enormously. The difference between night and day. And I have a chapter in the book about this. Technology has changed photography in a great, it's democratized photography. People could take on their cell phones now pictures that they could never have done before. They're ready immediately. They can send them to anybody they want. This is the digital photography. That's a relatively recent development. But now what Pete Souza did and what Obama did and what Trump can do is send these photographs directly to their constituents, through the White House website, through Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and so on. And they do. Under Obama, the White House sent millions and millions of pictures out, to millions of people, sometimes every day. And Souza would take pictures, and then he wanted to become a public figure in his own right. So he put pictures out. This is Pete Souza's favorite pictures of the week, and he described what he got. And this annoyed a lot of the news photographers, again, I talk about this in the book, who felt Pete Souza was saving all the best pictures for himself and wasn't letting the news photographers take the pictures that they could take before. There's a lot of antagonism there, and there still is. But if you combine digital photography with social media and the access people have to photography themselves, it's a whole, it's a difference between night and day. Remember the pictures some of us remember from many years ago where the big speed graphic cameras, those big cameras with the big bulb, and generally depicted in the movies with a guy with a hat with a press card in it. Those are pictures where the guy had to take, or the photographer had to take one frame out, put it away, and then put another one in. You can imagine how much time that would take. So that's why you didn't get many spontaneous pictures in those days. Now you can. You hit that shutter and you've got 100 pictures in a couple of seconds. And that's what they do. They just take frame after frame after frame. And there's an enormous change in the White House photography now because they can not only take a lot more pictures, very good pictures, high quality pictures, but they can transmit them immediately. And that's a huge change. And it gives the White House photographers a tremendous advantage that they never used to have before. So I hope that helps.
I read in the paper on Sunday that a woman who had asked to be the White House photographer for Michelle Obama was publishing a book of her 150 favorite pictures of Michelle Obama. So is it common for the First Lady to have a photographer, and then you can take this White House assignment and then take these pictures
Yes.
and turn them into a commercial enterprise?
Yes. At that point, they are under the same rules that the rest of us are under. Supposedly, the White House photographers are not, the staff photographers are not allowed to hide pictures, that keep them themselves and then use them later. Everything is supposed to end up in the archives, in the libraries, the presidential libraries. But then the photographers can use them later. Now, something like this, I'm familiar with the book you're talking about. Pete Souza has a book coming out. My book is coming up. I'm in a different category. I put all these stories together. Their books are basically testimonials to the people they work for. sort of homages to Obama and to Michelle Obama. But the pictures they're using are accessible at the libraries. You can get them. Now, they have an advantage because they know what they took, so they can find them a lot easier. The rest of us have to rummage through thousands of pictures to find these. And they can tell the story behind the pictures. But the pictures they're getting are not exclusive to them. If you look for it, you could get it yourself.
So do First Ladies have a staff
Yes,
photographer?
First Ladies have staff photographers, yes. In fact, Sheila Craighead, who's now Trump's chief photographer, was Laura Bush's First Lady photographer. So she had experience that way. Yes, I think we have, okay, yeah, we can go on, go ahead.
Yeah. Did you mention that there was one photographer that you didn't talk to?
Pete Souza.
No. Okay, so.
Every one of the chief photographers who are still alive I talked to. A lot of them have, who are, obviously who are passed away, have interviews they'd given. Some of them wrote books, some of them have diaries, some of them have interviews that they gave to their presidential libraries. So you can get information that nobody has gotten before if you take the time to look for those things. Sousa, though, very honestly, I communicated with him many times, and he said, I don't want to give you anything that's going to be something that I want to use in my own book, so I don't want to give you anything. But fortunately, there's a lot of record of Pete Sousa, so there's a lot of stories to tell about him, even without interviewing him. He's got a lot of on-the-record interviews and other things that have happened. Yes, sir.
It seems to me, and I'm wondering if you agree, that we like seeing photos of our presidents as down-to-earth people, but we also want them to look presidential. Are we asking the impossible?
Well, I mean, you know, I think they can be both. I mean, if you know, our most successful presidents have been able to be both and to convey both. Reagan did that. He conveyed sort of the idea of being an uncommon, common man, as the historians would say. Franklin Roosevelt did that. This is before the age of staff photographers, but he understood. You remember the pictures of him with Fowler, his dog, pictures of him throwing the ball out at the baseball games. He understood that there is the personal side that people want to see about a president, and that's why I'm so surprised that Trump, who has been so savvy in so many other ways in dealing with image and the media, has dropped the ball on photography. And like I said, just think of the pictures we've seen of Trump. It's almost always the scowling, angry president. And there's got to be another side. If there's not another side, that's an interesting story on its own. But he has not capitalized on photography hardly at all so far. Okay. Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. We're going to sign some books. Oh, thank you.
What do you give a man who has all sorts of presents from the Ford from Library Museum? Before you leave, since you're so interested in the photography, let me just share a couple of things. Ken mentioned what was Brezhnev doing wearing that jacket? Let me tell you the story behind the jacket. That is a wolf skin jacket made by Jack Kim in Anchorage, Alaska. Ford stopped there en route to Vladivostok, and Mr. Kim presented him with that jacket. When they were in Moscow, he was wearing it because, guess what? Their hotel rooms were bugged. So he and Kissinger stood out in the cold, and he wore that jacket for warmth. We have photos of him outside the building wearing the jacket. Well, Brezhnev fell in love with it, and so we have a whole series of wonderful shots, and I use it in one of my talks, of Brezhnev with that cigarette, you understand, and at the end, at the parting ceremony, Ford took the jacket off and presented it to Leonid Brezhnev. And then, of course, they were flying home, and he was without a jacket. So they flew back through Anchorage, and he confessed to Mr. Kim that he had given the jacket away. So at the Ford Museum, we have the replacement jacket, but they won't let me wear it. But it's wonderful. It's the real deal. So that was one. Secondly, about that, the photo of Betty Ford dancing on the table, that was on the last day in office. That was shot by David Hume Kennerly, the lead photographer. When Kennerly published his photo book called Extraordinary Circumstances a few years ago, he wanted to use that photo, but he was very uncomfortable. And so he first showed it to the Fords together and asked their permission. And of course, I'm not even sure President Ford knew it had existed at that point. But anyway, they blessed it. And actually, right now, there are designs underway for a statue of Betty Ford to be near the museum, probably not on our grounds, but right nearby. And our curator is our lead on that, and we're trying very much to represent the dancing Betty Ford, that image of her. Next year is her centennial, and in April we'll be opening her centennial exhibit, and I think the lead title is Dancing with Betty Ford or something, or something like that. But it is interesting in terms of those stories. And finally, to let you know, we have, just to give you a comparison on the numbers of the photographs, we were pre-digital, understand. And again, that's why photographers wore multiple cameras, multiple bodies, because you couldn't change film fast enough to take things. So at any rate, we have, in round numbers, about 500,000 audiovisual items in general. That includes other media, again, old 2-inch video and all of that from our time. About 350 to 375,000 photos from the White House years, 2.5 years. They are all on our website. So if you would like to browse to your heart's content, all of the contact sheets are on our website, and then if you want an image, then we can send it to you in high resolution. But you can browse our entire collection on our website. So that's how it's done, and they, as Ken said, they are your property. They're the property of the American people. But with that, thank you, Ken. It was wonderful, as I knew it would be. We have flyers, and again, remember outside the left-hand door as you go, flyers of upcoming programs. And enjoy the reception and take a look at his book. It has wonderful stories, and we're so glad to have you back again. Come for the next one.